The reason most people's relationship with money is confusing is not that economics is complex. It is that the model of economics most people were given was built to explain something other than how value actually moves. The model is familiar. You exchange your time for money. You work hard. You improve your skills. You become more valuable, and your compensation reflects that. The world is essentially fair in this respect. Effort, sustained over time, produces proportional reward. You know this model. You may have lived by it for years, and you may have noticed at some point that it does not fully describe what you observe around you. The construction worker who has worked harder than anyone you know is not among the wealthiest people you know. The person who appears to do the least, who moves money rather than materials, who organizes rather than executes, who positions rather than produces, frequently accumulates more. The gap between the model and what you observe is not an exception. It is a structural feature of how value actually moves. And Niccolo Machiavelli, who spent his career mapping exactly this kind of gap between official accounts and operational realities, gave us 3 precise observations that, taken together, begin to explain it. Machiavelli did not write about money. He wrote about power, about the distance between how political authority appeared to work in 16th century Florence and how it actually worked. In chapter 18 of The Prince, he observed, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are." He was describing a mechanism that operates identically in political life and economic life. Most people evaluate what they can observe on the surface. The operational reality lives underneath, in structures that are not immediately visible and rules that are not formally taught. By the end of this, you will understand the 3 gaps between the conventional model of value and the operational reality Machiavelli described, not as a guide to any particular financial decision, but as a framework for seeing more clearly what has always been there. The gap between the model and the territory is everywhere, and once you see it, the confusion starts to dissolve. Part 1. The model and the map. The model says effort produces reward. The territory says positioning produces capture. And every functional model of how value works contains a grain of truth and a systematic distortion. The model most people are given, work hard, improve your skills, receive proportional compensation, is not false. In the specific conditions it was designed to describe, it holds reasonably well. The person who works consistently, improves their capabilities and operates within a stable institutional structure will, in many cases, see their compensation rise in rough proportion to those efforts. The model describes a real phenomenon. What the model fails to describe is how value is created and distributed in conditions that diverge from those assumptions. It was designed for a world where the relationship between effort and output was direct, observable, and relatively stable. For an agricultural worker, a craftsman, an employee in a stable organization, the model captures something real. But for anyone whose value creation involves leverage, whose output is disproportionate to their direct personal effort, whose position allows them to capture value they did not personally produce, whose work is multiplied by systems rather than bounded by hours, the model not only fails to describe reality, but actively obscures it. Machiavelli understood this kind of gap as the central problem of political intelligence. He watched rulers operate under the assumption that their authority was grounded in what it officially appeared to be, in law, in tradition, in the formal legitimacy of their position, and failed to see the actual mechanisms by which power was being held, transferred, and lost. The official account said power flows from legitimate succession and legal authority. The operational reality said power flows from whoever controls the things that others cannot afford to be without, The gap between those two accounts was where political careers went to die. The economic equivalent of this gap is the distance between the labor theory of value, which says value is produced by the amount of work that goes into something, and the actual behavior of markets, which price things according to scarcity, urgency, and the alternatives available to the buyer. These are not the same principle. A surgeon performs fewer transactions per day than a data entry worker and earns orders of magnitude more. Not because surgery requires more hours, but because the problem it solves is more urgent. The alternatives are fewer, and the training required to provide it is longer and harder to replicate. The market is pricing scarcity and urgency, not effort. Consider the implication more carefully. Under the effort model, the surgeon and the data entry worker are both being rewarded for their time and their skill. The model says that different compensation reflects different levels of skill and training, which is partly true, but incomplete. What is actually different is the degree to which each of them occupies a position that the buyer cannot easily substitute. The data entry worker's tasks, however competently performed, can often be done by many people and increasingly by machines. The gap between what the patient needs and what is available to them if this particular surgeon is not in the room is catastrophically larger. The market is pricing that gap. Once you see this clearly, the frustration that comes from working hard without proportional reward, which is a real experience and a legitimate frustration, becomes more precisely locatable. The problem is not that the world is arbitrary or unfair in a random way. The problem is that the model you were given to describe it was built to describe a different kind of world than the one you are actually operating in. Understanding the actual model does not solve the problem, but it locates it correctly. And locating a problem correctly is the beginning of addressing it. Part 2. The 3 gaps. The fox does not work harder than the lion. The fox understands where the traps are. In chapter 18 of The Prince, Machiavelli wrote that a prince must be both a fox and a lion. The lion to confront what must be confronted directly, the fox to navigate what cannot be confronted directly. The fox does not win through superior force. The fox wins by understanding the terrain, by seeing the traps that the lion walks into, by finding the paths that the direct approach misses. In economic terms, the fox understands 3 specific gaps that the conventional model obscures. The first gap is between effort and impact. The market does not pay for effort. It pays for the removal of pain. The heart surgeon earns more than the data entry worker not because their effort is greater, but because the problem they solve is more urgent, and the alternatives available to someone with a stopped heart are considerably fewer. What the market is paying for, in both cases, is not the input or the hours worked, the concentration required, the physical or cognitive effort expended. It is paying for the output, the degree to which a specific problem has been resolved for a specific buyer who needed it resolved. The implication of this gap is not that effort is irrelevant. It is that effort is necessary but not sufficient. The person who works very hard solving a problem that is not urgent, not specific, and not scarce in its solutions will be compensated poorly despite the effort. The person who works on a problem that is urgent, specific, and difficult to solve through available alternatives will be compensated well even with less apparent effort. Understanding this gap does not tell you which problems to work on. That depends on your specific capabilities, circumstances, and constraints. But it does locate the gap between what the conventional model predicts and what you actually observe. The second gap is between presence and income. The person who must be personally present for every unit of value they create is bounded by time in a way that compounds into a permanent ceiling. The hours in a day are fixed, The rate at which any single person can be present is fixed. The income generated by direct presence, however high the rate, is therefore structurally capped. The person whose value creation does not require their direct presence for every unit, whose work is multiplied by systems, by other people, by recorded outputs that deliver value independently of their continued involvement, operates under different constraints. This is not a moral observation. It is a structural one. Machiavelli would have recognized it immediately. The prince who must personally resolve every conflict, negotiate every alliance, and maintain every relationship is bounded in a way that the prince who has built institutions, delegated authority, and created systems for governance is not. The third gap is between production and capture. Making something valuable and capturing the value of what you make are two different skills, and the conventional model does not distinguish between them. The person who produces excellent work but does not understand positioning, pricing, or the mechanics of how value is conveyed to buyers will consistently see others capture value they created. Machiavelli's observation about appearances, that most people judge by what they can see rather than by what they can verify directly, is as true in markets as in courts. The perception of value and the reality of value are not the same thing, and the gap between them is a constant feature of every exchange. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, the ideas that don't get softened, the ones that actually are something of you, subscribe to Wise Daily. That's what we're here for. These three gaps are real, but they are not by themselves a complete account of how value moves. And part 3 of this script is the one the source material I drew from entirely omitted, which is why the source material, for all its genuine insights, ultimately does more harm than good. Part 3. What Machiavelli cannot tell you. There is something in the popular Machiavellian content around wealth that I find genuinely troubling, and I want to name it directly. The framework I have just described, the 3 gaps, the fox over the lion, the distinction between effort and impact, is real. These are not invented observations. They describe actual structural features of how value moves in most market economies, and they are genuinely useful for anyone trying to understand why their economic experience diverges from their economic model. But the popular version of this framework makes a claim that the framework itself does not support. It claims that the gap between the model and the reality is the primary explanation for economic difficulty, that the reason most people are not wealthy is that they are operating on the wrong model. That once you understand the correct model, the fox is understanding the Machiavellian framework as the path becomes clear. Work on painful problems, create leverage, understand positioning. The wealth follows as a natural consequence. This is where I have to disagree, and where Machiavelli's own framework applied honestly produces a different conclusion. Machiavelli was deeply skeptical of the idea that good strategy alone determines outcomes. He devoted an entire chapter, chapter 25 of The Prince, to the role of fortune in human affairs, and his argument there is worth sitting with carefully. He estimated that fortune controls roughly half of what happens to us. The preparation, the strategy, the correct model, these matter, and they change the odds. But they do not eliminate the structural advantages that some people begin with and others do not. Understanding that the market pays for impact, not effort, does not create a painful problem for you to solve. Understanding that presence independence produces higher income does not give you the capital to build the systems that produce it. Understanding that positioning matters does not remove the barriers to accessing the contexts where positioning is possible. The source script from which this content is drawn says, in one of its 9 laws that poverty is a choice of tolerance, that your financial situation is primarily a function of the mindset and habits you have permitted. I want to say plainly that this is not what Machiavelli was arguing, and it is not what the evidence supports. Financial difficulty is produced by a combination of individual decisions, structural conditions, timing, access, and fortune, in precisely the proportions that Machiavelli would have recognized. The person born into poverty, without access to quality education, living in a community with limited economic infrastructure, facing discrimination in hiring or lending, is not primarily a victim of their own model. They are navigating structural conditions that the fox and lion framework by itself does not resolve. This matters because the misuse of Machiavelli as a framework for explaining economic inequality through individual character is both philosophically dishonest and actively harmful. It takes observations that describe real structural features of how value moves and converts them into a moral argument. The people who have not navigated these features correctly are responsible for their own position. Machiavelli was not making this argument. He was describing mechanisms that affect everyone differently depending on the position they are starting from. The fox's intelligence is genuinely useful, but the fox who begins in a cage is not in the same position as the fox who begins in an open forest, even if both understand the terrain equally well. Access to capital, to networks, to the kinds of educational and social infrastructure that make certain kinds of leverage available, these are not uniformly distributed. Understanding the 3 gaps changes the quality of your thinking. It does not change your starting position. And conflating the two is where the popular Machiavellian content around wealth consistently fails the people consuming it. Understanding the 3 gaps is genuinely useful. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And anyone who presents it as sufficient is selling something. Part 4, the one question. Machiavelli's most enduring contribution to economic thinking is not a formula or a prescription, it is a question. The same question he applied to political power, he would apply to economic value. What problem in the actual environment you are operating in is both sufficiently painful and sufficiently difficult to solve that the person who can solve it reliably will be compensated at a level the effort model cannot predict? This is the fox's question. It is not asking how hard you are working. It is asking what you are working on, for whom, and why the alternatives available to that person are insufficient. It shifts the frame from input to output, from effort to impact, from the internal assessment of your own worth to the external reality of what a specific person in a specific situation actually needs and cannot easily get elsewhere. The question does not come with a universal answer. The answer depends entirely on who you are, what you are genuinely capable of developing, what environment you are operating in, and what fortune has placed or not placed within your reach. Machiavelli was not naive about this. He knew that the same prince who would have flourished under one set of political conditions would have been destroyed under another. Adaptability, the capacity to ask the fox's question accurately for the specific terrain you are actually on, not the terrain the model says you should be on, was the quality he most consistently admired in the political actors he studied. This is the simplicity the title is pointing at. Not that accumulating wealth is easy. Not that the system is fair or that effort always produces its deserved reward. The simplicity is in the question itself. Most of the confusion around value comes from asking the wrong question. How hard am I working? Why is this not being rewarded? What do I deserve? When the market is answering a completely different one. What problem is being solved? How urgently does someone need it solved? And how many alternatives do they have? Once you see the gap between the question you have been asking and the question the market is answering, the confusion does not disappear. The structural conditions remain. The fortune element remains. The barriers that the fox's intelligence alone cannot navigate remain. But the confusion, the specific disorienting experience of working hard by the model you were given and not getting what the model promised, becomes located. And a located problem, even a structural one, is something you can begin to think clearly about. Machiavelli was not writing about money. He was writing about the gap between how the world appears to work and how it actually does. That gap is everywhere, and it always has a cost. Most of us carry an economic model designed for a world that no longer fully exists, applied to conditions it was not built for, producing confusion that feels personal when its roots are structural. The three gaps are real, they are useful, but they are not a formula, and anyone who presents them as one is missing what Machiavelli actually understood, that the terrain matters as much as the strategy, and that seeing clearly is not the same as winning. It simply means you are less confused about why. Machiavelli was not writing about money. He was writing about the gap between how the world appears to work and how it actually does. That gap is everywhere, and it always has a cost. Where in your own economic life do you notice the gap between the model you were given and the territory you are actually navigating? If that question landed, type "I see the gap" in the comments, not for me, but for you. And if this video gave you something real, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Wise Daily. Every video on this channel is built to give you one thing: the philosophical tools to live with more power, more clarity, and more intention. We'll see you in the next one. Machiavelli showed us the gap between the official account of value and the operational reality. But there is a philosopher who spent his life asking what you do with that clarity once you have it, how you act well within a system you cannot fully control, how you maintain integrity in a world where integrity alone does not guarantee outcomes. That philosopher is Marcus Aurelius, and the answer he arrived at, writing alone during the wars he never chose, is the subject of our next video.